Benoit, Deputy Minister of Alberta Intergovernmental, International and Aboriginal Relations.
Thank you, Oryssia. 3 weeks yesterday since I've been on this job, so I'm what they call a newbie compared to a lot of people in the room today, and it's just a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. The Honourable Cal Dallas, our minister, sends his regrets and wants me to convey his best wishes for this gathering. It's just a pleasure to see the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Patriation Negotiations being held here in Alberta, a province that played a vital role in the repatriation of the Constitution. It's also inspiring to see so many of the distinguished individuals who were involved in these negotiations here tonight, from previous federal ministers to former premiers, all of whom were strong and determined leaders of change. We're proud that Alberta's former federal and intergovernmental affairs ministry was also part of that esteemed group. During the deliberations 30 years ago, Alberta introduced the concept of the 750 amending formula that eventually became part of the Canadian Constitution, and I think was a breakthrough in those negotiations 30 years ago. What's notable about the contribution was the careful consideration of Quebec and Ontario's concerns, while respecting the equality of all provinces. This spirit of cooperation and fairness is the attitude that we continue to bring to our intergovernmental relations today. As a proud member of the Confederation, Alberta continually strives to effect positive change at the national level. We continue to advocate for a reformed Senate and equal representation in the House of Commons, two areas where change is long overdue. And we work with our counterparts at the Council of the Federation to ensure all provinces' concerns are heard and accommodated. As we work towards a better, brighter future, it's vital for us to learn the lessons from the past. So tonight, we have the opportunity to revisit an important chapter of Canada's history, one that shaped our province and indeed our country. So what we're hearing this weekend will shine a light on our history and illuminate the path for us in the future. Have a wonderful rest of the conference. Best wishes for continued success, and thank you for being here tonight.
Next, I'd like to call upon Debra Pozega Osburn, who's the Vice President of University Relations, and she'll bring greetings on behalf of the University of Alberta.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of University of Alberta Chancellor Linda Hughes, our President, Dr. Indira Samarasekera, and the entire university community, it is my pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be an incredible evening of personal and profound insight into this very important and historic event. We're all privileged to be a part of tonight's armchair discussion with the First Ministers. Now, I've been fortunate, as many of you have this evening, to have already had sort of a sneak peek and some insight during the reception as we've gotten to know some of our speakers and presenters tonight. And I really want to take just a minute here to take an opportunity to welcome the First Ministers who you will be hearing from a little bit later tonight. The Honourable John Buchanan, former Premier of Nova Scotia, is here with us tonight. Thank you. The Honourable Peter Lougheed, former Premier of Alberta, of course. And the Honourable Brian Peckfod, former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. We are so fortunate to have the three of you here tonight and look forward to seeing this pivotal moment in Canada's history through your eyes. So thank you. I would also like to acknowledge tonight's moderator, a man who has seen his own share of historic events firsthand, and that's the Honourable Jim Edwards, as well as the Honourable Jim Horsman, who will introduce tonight's discussion in just a little while. And I want to thank you for joining us, as well as Roxanna Benoit, Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental, International and Aboriginal Relations, who you heard from just a moment ago, and I want to echo your remarks about thanking the government of Alberta for its very important support for what's happening here over these last few days. Now, Alberta might not be the first province, nor Edmonton the first city that comes to mind, when Canadians think of the Patriation Negotiations. But as growth in the West continues to drive our country forward, there is perhaps no better place than Alberta's capital to have this discussion. This is a place where the traditional trade route of the North Saskatchewan River cuts through a city that now is alive with innovation. And this is in areas ranging from nanotechnology to virology to environmental stewardship, so very appropriate that we're here in this city and this province tonight and over these last several days to have these discussions. And because we can talk now about, we can think about where we have been as a nation and also where we want to go. The University of Alberta in particular is proud to be the home of the Centre for Constitutional Studies and congratulates the Centre on its work to put together this really remarkable program of speakers, both for this evening and for the other days of the conference as well. Now, in his first inaugural address, the University of Alberta's first president, Henry Marshall Tory, said of universities that, and I quote, "They have sprung from a demand on the part of the people themselves. The people demand that knowledge shall not be the concern of scholars alone. The uplifting of the whole people shall be its final goal." Now, this is a commitment the University of Alberta takes very seriously. And through the work of bodies like the Centre for Constitutional Studies, our university is proud to offer our fellow Canadians the opportunity to gather and discuss such pivotal moments in our collective history as the discussions that led to the patriation of our Constitution and the start of a new chapter in Canada's national story. President Tory's vision is further made manifest by the fact that the proceedings of this conference will be captured in a documentary. I don't know if all of you here tonight were aware of that, but this documentary is going to allow future generations to experience a unique combination of scholarly knowledge and practical insight, in which marks this really exciting conference. And I have to say, what better testament to the uplifting of the whole people than moments like this when academic disciplines and political boundaries are bridged in the name of better understanding of our collective past and what that means to a shared future. So thank you to all of you for joining us tonight, and on behalf of the University of Alberta, welcome once again to the armchair discussion with the First Ministers.
Thank you, Debra. This conference truly could not have happened without the very strong support at the senior administrative levels of the University of Alberta. Thank you very much. Let me call upon Jim Horsman, who will introduce the premiers. Mr. Horsman held a number of portfolios in the Alberta government, including Minister of Advanced Education, Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs from 1982 to 1992. He was my minister. And Deputy Premier. But first, like so many others here, Mr. Horsman, who attended the 1981 discussions, has an interesting story to tell, particularly in relation to the representations being made in the United Kingdom. Mr. Horsman.
Thank you, Riss. Mesdames, Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, mes amis Canadiens. That may sound a little bit like John Diefenbaker, I don't know, and his French. Well, we talked about November of 1981. And I'm going to tell you a little bit how I got to be there as part of the Alberta delegation. But before I do that, I just want to talk briefly about a few moments that I was at a Council of Ministers of Education meeting in New Brunswick, along with all the other ministers of education for Canada, and my colleague Brian Smith, who was then the Minister of Education from British Columbia. He and I were classmates at UBC, and in fact, so was Peter Mikason, who was there at the same time. He was an engineer, so he wasn't in the law school arena, but in any event, we got to be good friends there too. Brian was the Prime Minister of the Progressive Conservative Model Parliament, and I was one of his ministers. Hotbed of progressive conservatism. I don't suppose it is today, but in any event, we then became good friends, and we were off on behalf of the Council of Ministers of Education to London. The purpose of our trip was to discuss the subject of foreign tuition fees, which had been put up by the British government when they joined the European community. And we wanted to have that changed so that Commonwealth students could still receive the same treatment. Well, the day we were there, January 21st, 1981, the Sir Anthony Kershaw report came out. There's a Foreign Affairs Committee of the UK Parliament, and most of you are familiar with what it had to say. Basically, it had to say that the British Parliament should not proceed to patriate the Constitution without the involvement of the provinces. Well, we were supposed to be there for 2 days. In fact, it's interesting what happened. For the next 10 days, the doors of Westminster opened to we underling provincial ministers, much to the consternation of the feds in London at the time. Well, the doors opened, as I said, and we met with dozens of parliamentarians, both from within the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The 1922 committee of the governing Conservative caucus, the whips, ministers, despite the fact that we were told that we should not be allowed to be in their presence, they were happy to see us. They wined and dined us, and despite what you may have read, one particular lord that I want to mention to you is that I had tea with Earl Grey. Much has been written and said about the role of Mrs. Thatcher in her relationship to the Prime Minister at the time. And there's some questions have been raised about what was actually said and done. I only want to say that when she visited here in 1983, I think it was, and spoke to a very large crowd along with Prime Minister Trudeau, the next day she met with the Alberta cabinet under the leadership of Peter Lougheed. And on the way back to the airport, I escorted her for half an hour. I had the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the car with me alone, aside from the driver. And we had an interesting conversation. Now, what did these British parliamentarians tell us when we were there? First of all, it was clear that they had a good deal of knowledge about what was being proposed, and they were very interested. And they were concerned with their responsibility. And those people who've written and said that somehow or the other the Brits were going to interfere with the Canadian constitutional process, that they wanted to meddle around and try and retain their colonial leadership, is entirely false. What they were concerned about was doing the right thing as it appeared to them on behalf of, not only with respect to what the Kershaw report had said, and they were anxiously awaiting to hear what the courts had to say in Canada, and we've heard about that. And in general, I think it's fair to say that they believed, and they expressed that to us clearly, that the Constitution of Canada does not belong solely to the federal government of Canada. That was the message they made clear to us. Well, we reported daily to Edmonton, both Brian and I. Brian, of course, reported to Victoria. And we had a delightful time being entertained. And I think we learned a lot. And I think, in addition, those parliamentarians learned a lot from us that they weren't learning from other Canadians in London at the time. I want to go back just a little bit in this process to October the 2nd of 1980, that being the day when Prime Minister Trudeau announced that he was prepared to recommend the unilateral patriation of the Constitution without provincial involvement and consent. I happened to be Minister of Advanced Education at that time, and I was in Red Deer, Alberta, of Alberta, and there were a good number of them there. I forget the numbers, maybe 80 people in the room. And after the business sessions had ended, we went up to my room with my staff to prepare my remarks. And on television there was our Prime Minister. Well, I can assure you that I threw away my prepared remarks and went down to talk to the governors and told them what had happened. And I can assure you that on the heels of the National Energy Program, there was something close to fury in the room at what was being proposed by the Prime Minister. And for those people who are of the Liberal persuasion in Alberta, I would remind them that it's been very many long years since a Liberal was elected a member of Parliament from this province. Go back to the Alberta process, and I want to touch on this. Alberta took this very seriously. And in 1976, in the debate in the legislature, the following resolution was passed. Be it resolved that all provinces have equal rights and direct that the government should not agree to any revised amending formula which could allow any existing rights, proprietary interests, or jurisdictions to be taken away from any province without the specific concurrence of that province. In 1979, the Alberta amending formula was proposed by Premier Lougheed to the First Ministers' Conference, and by 1981, it had the support of 8 provinces. Now, how did Alberta policies get approved? Well, I can assure you that while most people agree that Premier Lougheed led, it is very clear that along with his then Minister of Federal Intergovernmental Affairs, Dick Johnson, there was always the thorough discussion and approval in Cabinet, in caucus, by the party, and in the legislature with full debate. That's the way we did things, not just on this issue, but on all issues of importance to Alberta citizens. Well, the weekend before the November First Ministers' Conference, there was a party policy convention here in Edmonton. 2 days of intense review and approval by the party of the negotiating position were provided to the Premier and Dick before they left the room with sounds of a standing ovation from over 300 Alberta PCs as the delegation departed for Ottawa. Myself, I went back to my apartment here in Edmonton. On a Sunday afternoon, I was on my knees when the phone rang. I wasn't on my knees praying for success. I was washing the kitchen floor. The phone rang and Peter Lougheed was on the line, and he said, "Come and join our delegation." So I did. Well, in 1982, there was a general election, and I was then appointed Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs, a position which I served for 10 years. And so I went through constitutional discussions for that extended period. And like other people have said today, the Constitution is not a done deal. In June the 3rd of 1983, I introduced a resolution to have the first amendment to the Constitution. That was the one regarding treaty rights and proposals for meeting to deal with Aboriginal issues. I got out Hansard of June the 3rd, 1983, and I read it all again, and it was so exciting. But in any event, it helped me form that. We had something called the Edmonton Declaration, and a lot of people have ignored this. But this was a meeting of the premiers, and it said this. This is August the 12th, 1986. The premiers unanimously agreed that their top constitutional priority is to embark immediately upon a federal-provincial process using Quebec's 5 proposals as a basis for discussion to bring about Quebec's full and active participation in the Canadian Federation. That was a very important item which led then to the discussions on the Meech Lake Accord. After that failed, I was asked to chair a select special committee of the Alberta Legislature to have public hearings. And from anybody who says we didn't consult the public, they are wrong. We went across the province, heard hundreds of presentations on behalf of Albertans as to Alberta's constitutional position that we should take to the next discussions. But it was rather challenging to get consensus. And I recall one day here in Edmonton, in a hearing where One participant came forward and said, every Canadian should be forced to be bilingual. The next presenter came and said, every Frenchman should be forced to speak English only. Well, how do you get a balance between those two items? The problem is it's very challenging. And therefore, those people who say it's very easy to consult the public and get consensus, they then took it to the process which resulted in the Charlottetown Accord, and then the referendum which defeated that accord. I decided to leave politics at that time. But there are outstanding issues, as has already been mentioned. Senate reform, Aboriginal issues, division of responsibilities, the Supreme Court of Canada, the Council of Federation, where do they fit? Well, those are some thoughts I wanted to leave with you. This is not a done deal. There's still work to be done. And I hope that there will be the kind of leadership in the future that will take us to resolve some of those outstanding issues, because the Constitution is a living document and should be fitted to meet the times. I'm going to introduce quickly the premiers. I'm not going to read their biographies, which are in the program. You can all read, I hope. John Buchanan, in addition to what's in the program, I want to mention that he has 5 honorary degrees. I also want to mention that he was in the Senate, that body, which Alberta had held in some, different point of view. I want to point out as well, though, just on a personal note, that my sisters-in-laws lived in his constituency and always voted for him. He wanted me to let you know that. I also want to let you know that my grandmother was born in Aberdeen. She's a Harper. She was a Harper. That's her, and that is a sept of the Buchanan clan. So I'm very closely tied into John Buchanan that way. Now, Brian Peckfod, who served Newfoundland and Labrador as the premier, wrote a book in 1982, right? In addition to his other qualifications. I actually bought that book and read it. Brian, of course, Brian is a true islander. He moved from Newfoundland and Labrador, and he moved to Vancouver Island. So he's been to every part of Canada, except Medicine Hat, he tells me. Mr. Lougheed, of course, what can I say about him? I served in his cabinet for several years, first as advanced education minister, and then, as I mentioned, federal and intergovernmental affairs until his retirement. And then I moved on with Don Getty, and we went through the Meech Lake Charlottetown process together. In addition to the things that are mentioned in his biography, he is also a member of the Alberta Order of Excellence, so I wanted to point that out. And in addition, I'll just say this. In this very room, on August the 30th of this year, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of his election of Premier of the province of Alberta. And what a distinguished record it is indeed. These are gentlemen who are truly Canadians. And they love this country, and they believe in it. They believed in it during their times in office. They believe in it today. And I think we are very indeed fortunate to have them with us this evening. Now, I'm going to conclude this way. In 1980, on the 30th of August, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of Alberta. And in Medicine Hat, which is my constituency, there was a large picnic gathering with several thousand people. And I'd been asked to participate and bring some greetings on behalf of Alberta. And it was windy that day, and I had some notes, so I asked the Master of Ceremonies as I approached the podium whether or not, or the platform, which had no podium, if there was a podium for my notes. And he said, notes? Speech? People came here to have a good time. They didn't come here to listen to you. So I'll call now on Jim Edwards to conclude this part of the program. Thank you.
I served in the House of Commons with Flora MacDonald, who was saluted earlier this morning. And Flora, not terribly well known, used to prepare for question period for an hour and a half in front of a mirror every day. And she said, "Jim, you don't realize anything about politics. Question period is theater." We are about to enter a theater setting in just a moment, and we need to do a little setup, and it'll be about a 2-minute break while that happens. But just before we get going, I think Mr. Horsman was telling, as were others at the table, some Diefenbaker stories. And my Diefenbaker story is the following, and I just ran across this tape as I was cleaning out a closet the other day. 1977, the chief had just published the 3rd volume of his autobiography. Not great literature, mind you, but a great historical record. And he was visiting in the Woodward's department store book section, autographing books. And he was getting tired because he would interview everyone who came along. "Oh, you're from Kanistano, Saskatchewan. I knew your uncle," that kind of thing. And so the book rep and I said, "Let's go downstairs and get a sandwich and a soup, and we'll charge our batteries." So we're sitting there having a soup and sandwich, and I said to him, "Mr. Diefenbaker, did you see the Grey Cup game last week?" "Oh, it was a disgrace," he said. I said, "What do you mean? The West won. It was played in Montreal. How could it be a better result?" He said, "There they were, up in the stands, Trudeau and Levesque, plotting the demise of Canada." For Dief, everything was politics. And everything has been about politics for the last almost 24 hours, and then into tomorrow as well. And the insights into politics that we're about to get, I think, are priceless. I want to introduce first my friend John Buchanan, retired senator of the Senate of Canada, previously 4 times elected Premier of Nova Scotia.
Majority governments.
Majority governments each time. The Honourable John Buchanan.
Look, don't be too concerned with all this. This is just part of my speech. Of course, I'm going to delve into Howard Leeson's book and read maybe about 3 or 4 chapters for you too. Is that all right, Howard? You asked me to do that, so I did it. First of all, I want to congratulate the organizers of this incredible historic event, the University of Alberta, and all of the participants here in what, there's no question, is a very historic conference celebrating, and I say celebrating, the 1981 Constitutional Conference, which brought the Constitution back to Canada, or to Canada, and did the amending formula and approved the Charter of Rights. It was a very historic get-together, and this is a very historic get-together. And at the 60th anniversary, I hope you'll invite me. Now, I'm also very pleased to be here with my dear friend Jim Edwards, who I have known for many years, but many years, because I knew so many of his colleagues in the House of Commons, starting off with my dear friend Bob Coates, who was in Parliament as one of the Diefenbaker guys from '57, and our dear friend, the late Robert Muir, who died just about a little over a month and a half ago. I read the lesson at his funeral, and it was an honorary pallbearer. And of course, then Lloyd Crouse from the Scotia of Nova Scotia, and so many other colleagues of Jim Edwards, Steve Proposky and Don Mazenkowski. I knew them all. I could tell you so many stories about Maz and but I won't, because I didn't want to bore you here tonight. But I just want to say how happy I am to be here with my 2 other Atlantic Canadian colleagues. Oh, wait, now, just a minute. Brian Peckfod, former Premier of Newfoundland, and, of course, my dear friend Peter Lougheed, whose mother was from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I want to tell you, I used that one a lot in Nova Scotia. But I think he used it a lot here in Alberta too, because there are a lot of Nova Scotians live here in Alberta. Look, I'm not going to bore you, I hope, tonight. If my wife was here, she'd say, that's the end of your speech, now end. But she's not here. She's on her way to Boston. I'm going to meet her tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow morning, I got to go to Boston. I got to go to Toronto tonight on the red eye, then get on a plane to go to Boston tomorrow, where I'm going to introduce and present a certificate to Gary Dewar, the former Premier of Manitoba, now Canadian Ambassador, who is getting the Distinguished Canadian American Academy Award at the the Canadian New England Business Council in Boston tomorrow night at a big black tie dinner, and I was the first recipient of that award in 2004. And I just thought I'd mention that to you. Now, you know, there are highlights in political careers. And I'm going to tell you some of my highlights of my political career. And I want to start off, of course, by telling you one of the greatest highlights of my political career was my 4 big majority governments in Nova Scotia. And only 3 other premiers had 4 big majority governments. And of course, here in Alberta, we'll never catch up with you, with Peter Lougheed and all the rest of them. It's 4, 5, 6, 7. Bill Davis and Peter Lougheed said to me back in 1990, "Are you going to run for a 5th?" I said, "No." And they said, "Good, don't try it unless you're in Alberta." Now, so that was one of the great highlights of my political life. The second highlight that I look back, and it has reference to the conference we're talking about now, was I negotiated and signed the first Atlantic Accord on natural gas and offshore oil and natural gas. You did the second one, but I did the first one.
Because you said, if anybody gets better, I'll get a 2. I did better, and you got a 2.
That's right. I was hoping you'd say that, because that showed I was pretty smart to put that clause in with Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien at the time.
But you put the heat on me.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. But it worked out good for you.
Because I was tougher.
How did we get into this? And of course, then negotiated and signed the 1986 accord with Brian Mulroney, which ensured that Nova Scotia would continue to get all of the benefits from natural gas and oil. You know, the unfortunate thing about politics, I did both of those back in the 80s. A lot of people forgot that, and some other premiers later on are taking credit for it, and they weren't even around at that time. But that's politics, isn't it?
True.
That's it. That's it. You know
true.
that.
Yeah,
you know
absolutely.
That. Now, I say that because that happened after the 1981 constitutional conferences, where Brian Peckfod and I and others ensured that natural resources of our province would remain with the provinces that we have had since 1867, and it happened in the conference of 1981. So I'd say indirectly, we were able to get those accords of 1983 and 1986. In addition to that, one of the highlights I look back on was we were able to pass legislation in Nova Scotia to ensure the equality of Acadians in Nova Scotia. And the Acadians in Nova Scotia date back to 1605. Long before the Scots came, or the English came, or the Irish came, or the Italians came, way back in 1605. I made that statement once at a dinner in Halifax at the Delta Hotel, and I said, you know, the Acadians were the first inhabitants and residents of Nova Scotia. And Chief Dan Paul off the Micmac got up and said, "Hey," he was a big man, "Hey, you forgot us." I said, "Oh, Chief, I'm sorry, you were first," because he was bigger than me. But we passed legislation to create the Acadian school boards in Nova Scotia in all the districts. We also passed legislation to ensure French schools all over the Acadian districts, and we had the very first one in Halifax, a full French school, and we were supporters, of course, of the Charter of Rights, which ensured that linguistic recognition for the English and French in all the provinces of Canada in that accord, and also to ensure that it was if numbers warranted at the time. And that has worked out very well. Now, having said all that, let's get into my speech. Now, maybe I should also mention that the historic conference of 1981 didn't begin in 1981. It began in 1979, right, Peter? It began in 79 when we had a conference, then continued on into 1980, then it continued on into 1981. And you know, I look back and I say how blessed I was that I was a participant in all of those conferences, and then later on I was a participant with Prime Minister Mulroney in the 1986 when we started, Brian, with Robert Barras's 5 points that he brought to the Premier's Conference, and it continued with Meech Lake in 1988 and in 1990, and we were part of that historic situation. Unfortunately, it did fail. So all of these conferences means that we were part of the history of Canada. And that's important, that we look back on that in years to come and people say, they were history makers back in the 1980s with all of these conferences, and particularly the one that we're celebrating today to bring patriate the Constitution to Canada, create an amending formula included in the Constitution Act 82 along with the Charter of Rights, which a lot of people opposed at the time, but I think has worked out very, very well in ensuring equality of fundamental rights and democratic freedoms for all of Canada. Now, when we came to this conference, some people said to me, when you arrived at the conference, what was your feeling? Because we had been there in 79 and then 80, and then we formed the so-called Gang of Eight. And Harry Howe, who was a beloved lawyer in Nova Scotia and one of the finest members of the legislature, my Attorney General, and Edmund Morris, he's unfortunately passed on. He was a great Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Gordon Coles, who was our Deputy Minister he was the Deputy Attorney General. We all came here with a lot of hope. We all came here realizing this might be the last opportunity we've had for constitution making in this country. But we also came here to ensure that our rights as provinces were protected and ensured in any constitutional change. And that's one of the reasons that we got involved with the Group of Eight. I don't know where they got that business of gang. We weren't a gang, we were a group of eight. But I guess some people said we ganged up on some, but we weren't a gang, we were a group of eight. Now, I should tell you that Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan were not original members of the group. It was a group of 6. But, as they say in politics, we saw the light in a few months. And Saskatchewan, my dear friend Alan Blakeney, and myself, we became members of the group of 8. I should tell you also that Alan Blakeney, one of the finest politicians in this country, was born in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. He graduated from Bridgewater High School. He graduated from Dalhousie Law School. And as these gentlemen recall, sometimes I'd open our conference with going around the table, and I'd get up and I'd talk about Peter Lougheed's mother being Nova Scotian, he being a Newfoundlander, Richard Hatfield being a New Brunswicker, and that Bill Bennett's father was from New Brunswick and lived in Halifax, and that Grant Devine, I always said, Brad, I don't know how I can attach you to Nova Scotia, but your wife's sister teaches school in Truro, Nova Scotia. And of course, I always mention Peter Lougheed's mother being a Haligonian. And the funny thing, when I'd come to Alan Blakeney, he'd say to me beforehand, are you going to talk about that? I say, yes, I am, Alan. Well, mention my brother and mention my sisters. I said, I will. And I'd say, Alan Blakeney, of course, he was born in Bridgewater, graduated from high school, law school, graduated from law school 2 years before I did. So, Alan, you're older than me. He said, just by 1 year, just by 1 year. And then I'd say, and by the way, Alan, I just want to tell you that your brother in Bridgewater is well, that your sisters in Kentville are well and still voting Tory. And all of you who know Alan Blakeney, he had a way of saying something. All of a sudden, he'd look over at me and said, by But I came west and saw the light. So those were incredible days that we had in those conferences. Now, having said all that, what did we feel? Did we feel it was going to be successful? I had an idea it was going to be successful. I watched the demeanor of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I like Pierre Elliott Trudeau, by the way, as an individual. I really did. I can tell you a story about him in Cape Breton, but that'll be a long time. I'd tell it. My wife was here, she'd say, shut up. Anyway. But I liked him. But you know what? We came to that conference of '81 convinced that this was the last kick at the can for Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. He wasn't going to run again. A great Nova Scotian, Alan J. McEachran, was the one who talked him into running again in 1980. And of course, Alan McEachran was going to sit for 4 more years, and then he went to the Senate. And we all knew, or we thought we knew, and we were right, that Pierre Trudeau probably will not run again. And he wanted to patriate the Constitution and amending formula and his cherished Charter of Rights. He wasn't going to have it passed at all costs, but to him, I think it was a do-or-die effort. He wanted that badly, even probably at the expense of losing Quebec, which he did in the end, and which we did. So we all knew that was going to happen. I just want to end by saying this. We put it together, all of us, on a morning breakfast. And as Peter Lougheed and Brian knows, we took all the proposals that morning, we worked on them all that morning at a breakfast meeting, and we put them together, and then they were brought to the conference that morning, and it was successful. And I want to say that Mr. Trudeau must be congratulated in getting it done, but I want to say the 10 provincial premiers, 9 provincial premiers, pat ourselves on the back. We made it happen. Thank you very much.
You know, there's an old Western political saying, John, that when the political speaker says, "and in conclusion," in the wintertime, that's when we go and warm up our cars. Brian Peckfod, Premier of Newfoundland, and his recollections of 1981.
Well, first of all, let me say that I have a humongous confession to make. Mr. Buchanan, my grandmother my grandmother was a Ross from Margaree Valley, Cape Breton Island.
I knew that. Yeah. The Ross farm is named after her.
Yeah, there's a lot of Ross stuff named
New
after
Ross.
them. There were 3 different families of Rosses, all of whom claimed that they weren't related to one another. I just came back from Scotland 3 weeks ago. Sure enough, you can't find that they were related to one another. The Highlanders did a great job. Very often they didn't, when they buried their families, they didn't put up any notice of where they were, so it's very hard to trace it. Although I did trace the MacDonald group back to a castle on the Isle of Skye, by the way, in 1720. And then they built a castle on the southern island of Skye after that. But anyway, the Rosses came out to Nova Scotia, and my grandmother is from Nova Scotia. So there you go, John boy. You've just picked up another notch on your gun. My talk is going to be a bit more serious, unfortunately. And of course, and it is, I suppose, inconsistent with the general perception of the Newfoundland humor and music and culture and so on. But there are a number of serious things to deal with here, based upon what has been said last night and today, with which I have to take issue. Says you, that's nothing new. Voltaire said, the great Voltaire said one time, "My trade is to say what I think." And I have to this evening. First of all, I want to clear up a whole bunch of underbrush that's been around for a long time, 30 years, as you, which is very important. I started to write a book 2 years ago, and then I came confronted with the Constitution issue. But I first became confronted with it 2 or 3 days after the deal was done. when I went back to Newfoundland. The first few paper reports were quite accurate, but after that they started to sort of go off target from what I had seen, and it was only 2 days or 3 days later. And so I called a journalist into my office on the 8th of November, 1981. And for several hours, I asked him to ask me questions about the conference, and then I answered. And that was a tape in those days, even before CDs. I kept the tape and I put it away. Didn't do anything about it. 4 days later, my two deputy ministers who were here at the conference, unfortunately one is deceased, the other is not here, wish he was, got together unbeknownst to me and wrote up their understanding of the conference, because they had also read some reports which they could not substantiate from their experience at the conference. That stayed like that for a long while. We were very busy in Newfoundland at the time. We were poverty-stricken. We couldn't pay our way. We were in desperate shape. You never know how bad it was. Whatever was high and bad, whatever was low and bad, we were both. And we couldn't pay our way. We couldn't balance our books, not even on current account, let alone on adding capital account. The financial markets had told us you can't put it all together because you're at a Baa1 rating. You got to separate it out, so we know how much is capital that you're going to have to borrow, and how much of your current account, which you can't cover, you're going to have to borrow too. That's how bad we were, real bad. So you have to understand that it was in that context that I actually went to that First Ministers' Conference on the Constitution and worked through that for a number of years after I became Premier in '79. I was also involved before that because I was on the PNP Committee of Cabinet with Frank Moores when the first stuff started. And so I was in on it from the beginning. I grew up in a family where my father worked for the provincial government after Confederation in '49. And so I was pretty familiar with government, even though I didn't have academic background and a few things after my name. I was very familiar with governmental processes and studied in university in history in Solon's stuff, and all through the Greek and Roman period up through the fall of the Roman Empire and Gibbon's book on the fall and Montesquieu and Mill and all them. So I was a student of that when I was in high school. But I made sure I surrounded myself with some really wonderful people. And as Roy said today of his wonderful people, I want to put on the record here tonight, because it's very important for what I'm about to say. My Minister of Justice at the time, who's now deceased, was a man by the name of Oppenheimer, very strange name for a Newfoundlander. He had Swiss background. They were in the fish exporting business. Mr. Oppenheimer was one of the most modest men I ever met in my life. He spoke 7 languages fluently. He learned Russian in his car as he drove from St. John's to Trinity on his tape in the car. And he spoke it fluently after 2 years. He went to the Sorbonne. He went to Fordham University, he went to McGill, he went to Memorial, and he got a first-class law degree from Cambridge while he sat in the legislature of Newfoundland. There were professors at the University of Calgary who did an article in 1999 about the Night of the Long Knives, who did it, who done it, which is completely inaccurate. I went in on a bunch of websites in the last 2 years to look at what was said. Just about everything on the websites, including those for students, is inaccurate. Some of it 40% inaccurate, some of it 60% inaccurate, some of it, but most of it not very well done, including the book by Valpy and Shepherd that some of you may know about, The National Deal, where there was no premiers in the room the night of the 4th thaw. What a misrepresentation of the history of a very historic event. Sad. I was never contacted. I've been never contacted by anyone. Second person in my delegation was a fellow that some of you know in this room by the name of Cyril Avery, who suddenly had a heart attack a couple of years ago and passed away. He was a student at the London School of Economics and taught there afterwards. Brilliant fellow. Born and raised in St. John's Centre. And anybody who knows him knows he was a brilliant fellow. I had a deputy minister, Ron Penny, who should be here tonight, who was a graduate law out of Toronto. And I had a special advisor, Kevin Martin, who should go on the record as well, who was a graduate of Queen's, and whose mentor was Lederman, famous. I guess some of you people remember him.
Professor at Dalhousie Law School.
Okay. Well, he also became our advisor, as did a very important gentleman out of Edinburgh, as did another important gentleman out of Australia, because they had a really good knowledge of the whole British constitutional processes. You should remember, ladies and gentlemen, that in 1919, somebody mentioned today about 1919 after the First World War, our position at the table at that conference was ahead of Canada's. Margaret Macmillan in her book recounts how the Canadians were very upset when they went in the room to find that the Newfoundlanders had a seniority position over the Canadians at that point in time. We were a full-fledged country, really, in 1832, with total responsible government in 1855. Our knowledge of all of this stuff, notwithstanding the fact that Cooper and Barry Cooper and Ted Morton could say in 1999 that how could some place like Newfoundland ever craft or have anything to do with constitutional making. I have their comments here. I have their apologies as well, in writing. So I want to put that on the record, because we came to these conferences very serious. Our constitutional position, by the way, was put on the table in the fall of 1980. One of the other very disturbing things about this business of how myths start and mythology and stuff, some people can be very good at framing the question. The fish and rights question came up during these conferences, where it was Mr. Trudeau who tried to frame the debate as related vis-a-vis Newfoundland and Canada, that we wanted fisheries rights over individual rights in a charter. He framed that, I didn't. At the time, when all of the 12 items were on the table from all the provinces, we were all in it together on that continuing conference of constitution making that Roy talked about today, we had our stuff on the table, as did everybody else. One of ours was fishery. As you know, since then, after that conference, back in 1991, in 24 hours, 40,000 people didn't have any work in Newfoundland. If that was in Alberta, it would be 400,000, or in British Columbia. Imagine getting up tomorrow morning and seeing 400,000 people out of work. One fell swoop. We were not arguing, as Judge Binney tried to, the member who was about to retire from the Supreme Court of Canada, tried to style it later, that we were looking for control over the fishery, where we were looking for shared jurisdiction. We always admitted, and on all of the written documents and any word that I have ever uttered, I have never said that we wanted control over the fishery. We wanted people to consult with us before they gave and traded away fish to Europe for hardly anything else in return. Some of you in this room went to a conference, thank God for the provinces, who went to a conference in Toronto that I called. You were there and you were there, all the premiers were there, that I called because we had just found out that behind our backs, they had just traded away another couple of 100,000 tons of fish per year to the Europeans. And every province turned up because they saw the sense and reason of our position. Unbelievable, man. Unbelievable. So when I made the comment, Mr. Goldenberg, when I made the comment about I'm closer to Levesque's position than Trudeau's, that was in the context of a hydro condition that nobody would even look at. That was in the condition under which offshore oil and gas resources, we would get nothing from them. It would all go to the feds, and then we would get the crumbs back. And now we're a have province because that didn't happen. And because we were unable to get, even though all the provinces in that continuing conference agreed with us on a better sharing of the fishery. Nova Scotia came on side, British Columbia came on side, everybody came on side supporting us at that bureaucratic level, and the feds said no. And it was into that context, and into the context of unilateralism and a better sharing of division of powers, that I made that comment. I never, ever agreed with René Lévesque on separatism or breaking up the country. We were one of the few provinces, if the only one, that elected to come into Confederation by referendum. 51-49, but it was still...
That's a clear majority.
Well said. So the context of this is, and everybody, even the courts now talk about, you can't go through the back door, what you can't do through the front door. Context is very important. The texture and atmosphere into which you were dealt a hand played a part into what your reaction was. So it was in that context that I said those words. It was no way meant. And most of the people at the time knew that. It was like when Mr. Trudeau, in one of our televised conferences, some of you might remember it, you can perhaps look it up on the archives of CBC or CTV somewhere, when he talked about, we only want the fish. Right? And he said it in the context of it being international, and everybody knows the ocean is international, and the 200-mile limit, and all of that. And I still got to try to explain to Canadians, and I said to him that day, which I don't think the press got the import of, because they didn't understand the fishery. They don't know a herring from a mackerel, let alone from a cod or a turbot. They don't understand that. And I said to him, and there were a few in the room who understood it, and I said, yes, sir, that's fine, but they swim from offshore Newfoundland to inshore Newfoundland, inside the 3-mile limit. Who owns them as they swim? A little bit more complex than the simplistic juxtaposition of verbosity to try to make one of us look bad. So look up all your websites and you'll see a lot of this stuff is wrong. That interview that I did is 24 pages long. I've transcribed it 2 years ago. I didn't even look at it before then. I looked at it during the Cooper Morton fiasco of '99, but then I put it away again. And I've taken it out again because of my book. And it will be published next year with all the documentation in here, which I have here tonight. But this preempted, and it's caused me to come forward now with the following. This is a summary of the 24 pages, and essentially the several pages that the two deputy ministers put together independent of me about what happened. Summary of a taped interview. The whole interview is 24 pages with the Honourable A. Brian Peckfod by the late Randy Joyce of St. John's Daily News, conducted on Monday, November the 8th, 1981, at the Premier's office in St. John's, Newfoundland. The patriation process and final agreement of November 3rd to the 5th, 1981. When the conference got started, the 8 provinces' position was the accord of earlier that year, April, to which they had agreed. The Prime Minister's position, and thus that of the federal government, was the federal resolution before the House of Commons. As the conference proceeded, the PM seemed to show flexibility on the amending formula, and the provinces seemed to show some flexibility as it related to the Charter. On Tuesday, November 3rd, the 8 provinces assembled, and I never heard any about this today or yesterday. and assisted BC in a proposal that they were crafting. It included the Accord plus a small charter involving democratic rights and fundamental freedoms. That afternoon, there being no closed meeting with the PM, we let it be known that we wanted a meeting with the Prime Minister to present a proposal. Premier Davis was contacted and asked whether he would support such a proposal. He said he would study it and indicated that he was willing to act as an intermediary with the PM. However, we had already appointed Premier Lougheed, Premier Buchanan, and Premier Benoit to represent us, but agreed that Davis could be part of the delegation. The meeting was held with the PM, but he rejected the proposal. Have you heard that before? Very few of you have. At breakfast of the 8 premiers the next morning, Wednesday, November 4, there was a unanimous support for BC to present the rejected proposal at the meeting of premiers and the PM later that morning. This was important to the premiers then, since if the conference failed later, they wanted it on the record that the provinces had made such a proposal and that it would show that the provinces were being flexible and really wanted the conference to succeed, with a bit of a charter in there as well. The charter was very important to a lot of the provinces, and somebody said today about the charter Trudeau's position about the referendum and stuff, and the whole judiciary leadership business wasn't very important to him. It was to the provinces, and that wasn't emphasized enough today. It was to the provinces. So to get the provinces to agree to something like that and actually go to the Prime Minister privately was a big deal. This was agreed to at breakfast, that BC would present this an hour later to the conference. At the last minute, before the meeting, was to begin, BC reneged on presenting the proposal. My memory is that Premier Benoit contacted Premier Lougheed at the last minute and indicated he had changed his mind. We were all shocked, but what could we do? Premier Blakeney, Saskatchewan, also had a proposal to present. And we had persuaded him to allow Premier Benoit to go first. Now that BC was no longer going to present their proposal, when the meeting began, Premier Blakeney proceeded to present his province's proposal, and it was discussed at length for a number of hours, covering all the key aspects that we had been talking about, that will come up now in a few minutes, that were in play at the time. At the end, though, the PM would not accept it, so it didn't go anywhere. The meeting seemed to be headed for a stalemate, and it was then that I began writing down a few ideas on where I thought common ground was possible. Namely, the PM seemed flexibility on examining various options for an amending formula, and the provinces seemed some flexibility on considering a charter, although the elements of that were still in flux. I was hoping to present this to the premiers Wednesday afternoon meeting that had been tentatively arranged with a few of the premiers and the officials. The meeting never happened, and hence this proposal never got tabled. And this proposal is right here in front of me tonight. This proposal is right here. I have it here with me, okay? But it never got presented. So, where do we go from there?
I wonder if we can
Here was the proposal.
later.
Pardon?
Can we get back to this in the Q&A
Well,
session
I'd like to finish this. Acceptance of the 8-province accord, acceptance of a full charter with 2 amendments, minority language rights, and amendment to mobility rights. By the way, there's copies of this going to be circulated. At the end of that morning session, the PM was more or less resigned to a failure, or was this a tactical move on his part, and mused about just doing patriation and over the next 2 years having a double referendum, one on the amending formula and one on the charter. Early that evening, the Newfoundland delegation, Minister Ottenheimer, Avery, Deputy Minister Penny, Martin, Special Advisor, and myself began to put a proposal together, of which I have a copy here. It was prepared building on the early ideas, and the proposal was never presented and With my approval, Penny and Avery went to the Chateau Laurier force floor to discuss the document with the officials from Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC. Soon, Premier Buchanan of Nova Scotia, Premier McLean of Prince Edward Island, and Premier Blakeney of Saskatchewan attended the gathering. Meanwhile, I had spoken on the phone earlier that evening to Benoit, McLean, Blakeney, and Buchanan. Mr. Avery called me at the Four Seasons mid-evening to report that he thought some progress was being made, that he was getting a general favourable reaction to the proposal, and that I should be ready to come to the Chateau later if this positive reaction continued. Meanwhile, Minister Ottenheimer contacted Minister McMurtry of Ontario and informed him of what was happening. He seemed pleased and said he would ensure that Premier Davis was informed of the meeting. Around midnight, Mr. Avery called again saying the good progress was being made and that he thought I should join the group to further advance the proposal. I hailed a cab at the Four Seasons, went to the Chateau Laurier, joined the group. 3 premiers, Blakeney, Buchanan, and McLean, were there, and some of their officials and ministers. The officials of BC, Smith representing Bennett, Alberta, Meekinson representing Premier Lougheed, and of course the Newfoundland deputy ministers. Minister Romano of Saskatchewan joined later at some point. Ministers Howe and Morris were there from Nova Scotia, Minister Carver of Prince Edward Island, all 3 having been there most of the evening. A lot of discussion ensued. I underscored that we were there to fashion a bargain, not to organize a defeat. A lot of discussion centered on the Charter, the notwithstanding cause, minority language rights, mobility rights. At the end, an agreement on the elements, not much different than what was in our proposal originally, was agreed. The final proposal was prepared and typed in our delegation, having been approved by those present to be presented at breakfast. Nothing was finally decided that night. All these elements were there, ready for the premiers the next morning, because Mr. Lougheed hadn't been there that night, even though Mr. Meekinson was. Mercier was being contacted by Carver. Mercier of Manitoba was being contacted by Carver of PEI. The final proposal prepared and typed for our delegation had been approved by the province to present at breakfast at the 8 province that morning, 7 hours later. Minister Carver of PEI, under instructions from the group, contacted Minister Mercier of Manitoba to ensure that the province would have the information before breakfast the next morning. Premier Lionel had to return to his province to campaign, but Minister Mercier was in touch with him. Contrary to a lot of commentary over the last 30 years, there were 4 premiers present that night, and representatives 2 more were present, British Columbia, Alberta, and 2 other provinces not present were contacted that night, Manitoba and Ontario. So 8 provinces knew about what was happening that night. Quebec was informed at breakfast that morning of November the 5th, and New Brunswick just before the proposal was presented to the conference later that morning. At breakfast 6, Quebec said it could not support the proposal, and Premier-elect was unhappy about our proceeding that night and abruptly left the breakfast. And so 6 provinces supported Newfoundland presenting the province's proposal to the full meeting of the conference an hour later. That's the end of the interview.
Thank you.
And then I have the draft copy of the proposal that went to breakfast and then went to the full conference, of which I have copies here.
Thank you, Premier Peckfod. Thank you very much. Now, a distinguished alumnus of the University of Alberta Law School, Premier Peter Lougheed.
Thanks very much, Jim. Let me start by congratulating the organizers, Jim, of this conference. I look around the room and I know a fair number of them. They've worked very hard, and it's been a very effective conference. I also look at the gathering that we have here, and it's really quite a remarkable gathering of people from all across Canada. And I think, again, your interest and your attention, and as I look around and just look at your faces, I can tell the significance that this conference has been. It really is a fascinating gathering that we'll all remember being part of. I want to start because I've just been almost overwhelmed with this book that Howard Leeson put together on the Patriation Minutes. I didn't even know of its existence. I had no idea it was being developed. I think it's just an amazing document. It's an extraordinary document. And I think in terms of the history of Canada, this document, if you haven't get it, is going to be one of the really key documents in the history of Canada. It's put together very, very well by Howard as well. There's a number of things in it that I would want to quote from, but I will only really take one major one, and it needs to be read, Jim. It's on page 99, and it's the last paragraph in the document. And I quote it. In her remarks at the Patriation ceremony in Ottawa on April 17, 1982, Queen Elizabeth II praised the First Ministers for having, quote, good sense and tolerance, end quote. By contrast, in their book, The National Deal, Robert Shepko Volpe thought that this description was, quote, nonsense. They described the First Ministers as, quote, petulant and intransigent, end quote. I agree that sometimes they were petulant and at other times they were intransigent. On the whole, though, my opinion in this matter sides with Queen Elizabeth. When faced with a crucial choice between personal desires and the need to provide the nation of Canada with a just and honorable compromise, they chose the latter. Not much more can be asked of any of us, end of quote. That's an amazing paragraph. There's others in this book, too, that are very, very fascinating as well in terms of the history of it. Howard has just done a marvelous job putting this together. And for those of you who haven't got it yet, please get it. It also has in it an extraordinary group of photographs that deal with this particular issue. And I just wanted to say to you that my enthusiasm about what we're doing here tonight and what we're doing here in these 3 days is emphasized very much by Howard Leeson's The Patriation Minutes. Now I want to go on now and talk about the process here in a very brief way. Prior to this 1981 conference, the First Ministers had many conferences. Mr. Trudeau started this fairly shortly after I became Premier and he became Prime Minister. And we had also the Premier's Conference as well. And the players were, this is something when you think about this issue to keep in mind. There were quite a few of us who were there for an extended period of time. Bill Davis and I in 1971, John Buchanan was involved, Alan Blakely as well. Mr. Levesque himself was very much in this period of time. So there was a group of us, as those in this room know and understand, that were there, and Mr. Peckfod joined with us later. And we developed friendships, despite all this tension and all that went on that have lasted and reflected in this evening tonight. I remember with Bill Davis just an amusing story because everybody thought that we were at odds about almost everything. We were at odds about quite a few things, but about everything. But we had this is a private story that I think should be told to a meeting like this. But what Bill Davis and I used to do is that if there was a Monday night that we were having one of our meetings, interminable meetings, we would stand up at the Governor General's residence in Rideau Hall, and we'd nod to each other, and we'd leave. And of course, everybody thought, well, they're going to go and talk about the Constitution, and we'd go back to Bill's room and watch Monday Night Football. Pulled that off for quite a few years. It was, when I think about the Constitution, I think about what came before it, and what came before it had to do with the energy conferences that we held, which came before the Constitution. And this was a very crucial part of the history of the Constitution as well, as it ended up and is involved, because it was really crucial to Canada to develop our relationships with regard to energy as well as it came to be, and as you know, in the final go-around. I think back about the Constitutional Conference in Ottawa on September 5th to 12th, 1980, and Mr. Trudeau and the 10 premiers met, and we tried to resolve and work it out, but the Prime Minister rejected the views of the premiers at that time. And October the 2nd, 1980, he proceeded to move unilaterally to the United Kingdom Parliament, as all of you know. Well, the 8 of us got together, the 8 that you're well aware of, to deal with it in terms of common action. And we met as a group of 8. We met in Ottawa, and it was a fascinating meeting. We met on April the 15th and developed an accord where the 8 of us signed. Now, this is the part in Mr. Meekeson's incredible book here. Constitutional Patriation deals with this in terms of the correspondence. I should mention about this book. Peter Meekeson and I worked on this, and what we did is we thought the best thing we can do, if I wrote Mr. Levesque, which I did later, is to summarize the history of what happened. And if you haven't got this book, I urge you to get it. It really is an amazing, what we did. We put together all these points, and I'm going to mention a few of them in a minute or so. We put together all these points with regard to the constitutional process and the patriation and the position of Quebec. But we summarized it in a series of points, and I'll refer to a few of them. But they were done in a way that was perhaps really quite surprising. We reached the conclusion, because we had enough time to do it, this was after the event, as you know, I guess a year after the event, we contacted each one of the premiers and sent them a draft of the document. Peter Meekeson and I did. And they saw it and sent back their comments. But every one of the premiers had an opportunity to put some input into this document and into that letter that went to Mr. Levesque. I think that was extremely important, and that's why I commend this, among other reasons, this book to you as well. Then we hit the question of the Supreme Court of Canada and the reference case. And I was pretty nervous about this. I remember we had a number of legal opinions from all the people that we were involved with. But that Supreme Court of Canada decision came out on September the 28th, 1981. Think of the timing of that, September 28th, 1981. Just a short time in weeks before the major conference occurred. Well, it came out with a judgment that was fascinating. I was in a mission to Europe. Mr. Trudeau was in the Far East. We both were contacted by the media. We both commented entirely differently. He commented about the legal position and said that the federal government won. I commented about the conventions and said the provinces won. And there was the issue set forth before the public of Canada at that time. It was a fascinating story, and we went hard to work in terms of the convention and trying to convince the public with, I think, some considerable success that it really, the Supreme Court of Canada decision was very, very positive to the provinces. So that brought us to the Constitutional Conference of 1981, November the 1st to 4th, 1981, just right in my memory. And in this book of Peter Meekeson's, there's a good summary of it, of what we tried to do. We sort of came, well, I guess we came to the conclusion that we would try, each of us, to present our own positions, and the premiers all did that very effectively. But it led to this breakfast meeting, and here's where there's some differences that occurred on November the 5th, 1981 at 8 o'clock in the morning. This was a meeting in which we got together, the 8 of us, and Newfoundland and Labrador presented their proposal, which Brian has just referred to, which became the essence of what we presented to the conference later on. It started at 8 o'clock, and all of you in this room have been in meetings and know the significance of this. The meeting started, everybody was there right at 8 o'clock, and it started very much on this, and it's described here in some detail in page 21 and 26 and 27 of Mr. Meekeson's book, which I urge you to read. And what it really amounted to was that Mr. Levesque didn't show up until 23 minutes, and I made a particular note of that, 23 minutes after.
You mentioned it to me.
Yeah, I mentioned,
at the time.
yeah, I did. 23 minutes. Later he arrived, so he was there for only 7 minutes of the meeting. And then, of course, we were due on into the meeting at 9 o'clock the next morning with Mr. Trudeau and the rest of the other delegations. So it was a fascinating situation. I want to say a word about the atmosphere that's involved here, because I think that it's relevant. We were in the conference center, and it was a different atmosphere when we were in the general meetings, and you've seen the photographs earlier today. And then we went to Sussex Drive, and I had no idea there was any recording of what was said, and here it is, and every page of it that it was being recorded, and I've been reading it. I haven't finished it yet because I just got it, and fascinated with it. It was a very effective room, and Howard's book is just a gem for understanding what went on. Let me conclude with assessment of this. I think this Constitution of Canada, without Quebec involved, is a remarkable accomplishment for our country. A remarkable accomplishment, it really is. Because I think what we have done here is create a situation with a federal system where the federal system is so significant, and we've got ourselves in a position that we can all be proud of a constitution that we have in Canada, and in my judgment, it's working. It's working in a significant way. It's working, and this is one for the Quebec delegation, but for all of us, it's working even though Quebec did not sign on. I must admit that when that happened, I wasn't sure how it would evolve, and I don't think any of you in this room, because all of you were involved in it, whether it would work out, but it has worked out. And if you look at Canada today now and our position in the world, and you look at the future of our country, you have to be optimistic about Canada. Here we have a constitution that seems to work for us. It seems to have the right balance between the federal system. It's a federal document. And I think that for those of us gathered here in this room for this particular conference, I conclude by saying that we're very fortunate people in Canada to be able to have pulled this off and gone through this process and ended up with a constitution that has the support, in my judgment, and the understanding right across the country. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask people who would like to pose questions to line up here at the microphone, and while you're doing that, I wanted just to make an observation that when you look at the photographs in Howard's book and in other accounts of the conference, there's something that is missing today that was very much present 30 years ago, and that is smoke. There was lots of smoke. René Lévesque was never without a cigarette, and Bill Davis had his pipe, and there were other pipe smokers as well. There, we got someone at the, go ahead with your question. Identify yourself, please.
Brendan Legault from the University of Alberta. Gentlemen, one of the requirements that all of you had in your, when in your common position in the constitutional negotiations was, of course, opposition to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and if you were going to consent to it, the requirement to have an understanding clause in that. With the humblest of respect and at the risk of offending Province's Minister of Energy, that's a rather puzzling thing for a member of my generation to understand. with the benefit of hindsight, do you think that the Charter has had a positive effect? And were some of the concerns you initially had when you opposed it, have any of those come to fruition?
Mr. Lougheed and then Mr. Buchanan.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just want to say that as far as Nova Scotia is concerned, we have no regrets. I think the Charter has worked very well for our country. It has worked very well for Nova Scotia. Our rights have been protected by the Charter. Fundamental and democratic rights have been, and provincial rights have not been taken away because of the Charter. It has worked, and I think it will continue to work.
It's a puzzling question, but I think I come down on the view that it has worked pretty well, the Charter, and I think that the Supreme Court of Canada, in the way they have been dealing with the decisions, generally speaking, in the last period of time, make me feel positive towards both the way the court is responding to it and recognizing it. It's complex, and I don't feel that way all the time with regard to their decisions, but I study them pretty carefully whenever they come out, and I think in balance, the court have responded to the authority that was implicit there in the Charter, and perhaps more extensively than I would have thought.
I think they've done better in recent years than they did in the first few years on their decisions. But there was a deep concern, as we talked about earlier today, about the whole business of judiciary overbearing into policymaking and so on, and why a number of provinces had those concerns about it, and why the notwithstanding clause and non-abstanding clause was considered. Early on in the thing, as I made in my presentation, there were a number of provinces who, even on principle, were not all that, excited about the Charter in principle. So both sides came a long way. The Prime Minister on the amending formula and the provinces on the Charter. And then it became a question of how much was going to be in the Charter and what kinds of things were going to be in there. But on balance, I would agree with Premier Lougheed.
Thank you. Next questioner.
Gentlemen, my name is Mike Decor, and I wanted to thank you for turning out tonight to answer our questions and speak to us. I'm curious, in terms of looking back, this dovetails into the previous question. The Charter has now played a role in our international obligations, safe injection sites, so many things. Are you surprised at the role it's taken in Canadian society and the development of the law looking back?
Lougheed?
I'll start. Really, I'm repeating what I just said almost, because I believe the Charter, where I had my apprehensions and concerns, has worked out better than I expected. And partly that is due to the courts and the way they've handled it and handled the judgments. As I mentioned in the earlier answer, I don't agree with all of them, but they've made a very significant contribution. And the other thing that I have to say on a personal basis, because I know a number of them, they've really worked hard on the Charter cases. And they spend a lot of time gathering together as a court. I know this, they brought me in for a discussion with them about that. And that really speaks very well of the court and how the court are responding to these challenging matters.
Premier Buchanan?
Well, I certainly agree with Peter Lougheed. There's no doubt in my mind that the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia have respected what politicians have done in the Charter, and the balance has been very good between the political side and the judiciary side in its decisions. So I'm quite satisfied, as I said before, that our rights have been protected as provinces, the rights of individuals have been protected, and everything is balanced out very equally for the country, and the country is better off with the Charter.
I would just add that I have some concerns. I think it was early on. Was it to do with salaries for judges, where they got involved themselves in making the decision about it?
Provincial judges reference.
Provincial judges, was it? Yeah, where they really sort of made some decisions that bear no resemblance to whether the ability of the province to pay would enter into it. I would refer you to Judge Marshall of the Appeal Court of Newfoundland's commentary upon a number of those decisions, if you're really interested in. Yeah, and no doubt from Nova Scotia somewhere in London. But in any case, he has some very interesting things to say. I don't know if anybody's ever read any of his judgments on this, but I would refer you to them. I do have some sympathy with the gentleman from Quebec earlier today who talked about some kind of a review system on this. We take a really hard look on this to see whether over time there can be some process for that. I just want to add that I didn't get a chance to finish. One of the problems with this setup tonight is that other speakers today got longer to speak than we did, and I was brought up on the concept of fairness when I used to be on the soccer field back when I was 5 years old. So I have a little problem with that, because what I really wanted to say, and which nobody wants to say, I guess is an elephant in the room or whatever, is that from my experience of the constitutional thing, we never saw any material from the kitchen. And what was talked about in the afternoon and evening of December and through the night of December emanated from the provinces and came out to the breakfast meeting the next morning. And I think I asked Mr. Lougheed today, and I asked Mr. Buchanan today, that they take the same position, and they do. And I went and I talked to Mr. Passay and to the lady this evening as well. And I think the document that they received the next morning, sometime after 8, quite likely after 9, was the document that the provinces had at the breakfast, and of which I have the copy of the original, the second draft that night, and the final draft that was at the breakfast, and then into the conference. And if you read this final draft that went to the conference, the form and mode of the final agreement is almost identical, except for the addition of the Aboriginal, which came in and came out of ours during the night. The other change was it wasn't the government of Newfoundland anymore presenting something to the rest of the provinces. It was the federal government and the provinces agreeing, and non-obstante came out for notwithstanding. And then a few things about the 5 years as related to the notwithstanding. Otherwise, the words are identical to the ones that the provinces had at breakfast and that night. And that the whole frame and form of the agreement that was signed that day is totally identical to the one that the provinces had that night and that morning at breakfast, and then was presented to the conference. I don't say that with any delight, I just say it for the record.
Thanks, Premier Peckfod. The next questioner.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening session. Roy Romano phrased it today with the language of trust.
I'm hearing you speak to you. Who am I listening
to everybody.
Guy Laforêt.
We can't see you.
Guy Laforêt, sorry. So let me rephrase it. Okay. Your relationship with René Lévesque, I'd rephrase it, reciprocal breach of trust. You had a consensus with Lévesque as part of your agreement that if somebody, you could change positions, but if you change position, you would warn the others. So when Lévesque accepted, at least for a while, on November 4, Trudeau's offer of a referendum, technically speaking, he broke that agreement, so you could call this breach of trust. However, later on, when you negotiated with each other, yes, and you didn't warn him, in a way you broke that agreement as well. So I'd rephrase it.
The only difference is that breakfast meeting, nothing had been finalized. Right. It was that meeting where it was finalized, where Lévesque had full opportunity to propose, which we asked him to do, in the same way as all the other provinces did. It was a one of timing in bringing something together for all of us to look at. So, and we never ever said anything about him going with Trudeau on the double referendum stuff. We never told him he was breaking the agreement he had with us or anything. We overlooked it for the sake of trying to get a deal.
And he was 23 minutes late.
You were there, I was not. I'm not going to challenge you on any of these things. But if you would just allow me to close it, it shouldn't
No
be
problem.
too long.
Go ahead.
So I'd call this, between you at Lévesque, reciprocal breach of trust. I wanted your comments, you already started.
Yep.
Your relationship with Trudeau, I think that Mr. Romano exaggerates the issue of trust. I'd rephrase it, more interest and necessity than trust, and I'd like to have your comment on that as well. Thank you.
Well, I'll go first. I think he may have overstated the case as related to trust. I think both Peter and John and I'll speak for myself as it relates to Mr. Lévesque. I found Mr. Lévesque overall an extremely engaging, interesting person. And I write this in my book, which you'll see next year, where I talk about him and contrast him with Mr. Trudeau. He had, if I may, he was one of those people who had the ability to go from the world of theoretical concoction to how it works on the ground for the average person, which a lot of leaders don't have. And he could do that, and that aggravated, in my view, Trudeau to the nth degree. When we were at the Sussex Drive on a number of occasions, when there would be this ping-pong dialogue between Lévesque and Trudeau, because they were next to one another because of the Confederation thing, right? So I was furthest away with and then Peter. I remember these ping-pong dialogue things, this tit-for-tat kind of stuff going back and forth. And most often, most of us really sided with Lévesque in the sense that he had a better grasp of the nature of man, if you want, of everybody than Trudeau did. Trudeau was more aloof about it than Lévesque was. I spent a lot of time with Mr. Lévesque, both on the constitutional file, but also at the same time with the hydro file. We spent, I don't mind, this is a little incident that you might be interested in. We were down at the New England Governors Eastern Premiers Conference, and we were stalemated over hydro, and we were talking about the Constitution as well. So he said to me at lunch, why don't we stay over and we get together and talk about this, and we did. And he rented a boat, and they had two security guys out in Lake Champlain, and here was Lévesque with his girlfriend and myself, and we were drinking scotch and jumping over into the water, and then coming back and having a cigar and a smoke and another scotch and then over into the water again until we got exhausted, and then we started to talk about hydro and the Constitution. So I did have some casual, more friendly, wet and dry times with Mr. Lévesque, and they were extremely engaging, and not only engaging, but I got to see the person. He came to Newfoundland on a number of occasions and went down to the Fishing Admiral on Water Street and totally took over the place, both from the point of view of his delegations coming there for fresh fish, as well as from his personality. And they always said, to this very day, that the most important person that ever came to their restaurant was Lévesque. He went around, he was nice to everybody, and he was just so engaging. So from that point of view, and I always thought, and I've heard John say on a number of occasions about, if Morin and Parizeau wasn't around and some of the more strident members of his delegation, could have we got a deal? One morning I get up and say yes, next morning I get up and say no.
Thank you. Now, I know that we've heard from Premier Buchanan that he has a plane to catch, but I think you've got a brief response.
Can you imagine? I'm going on a red-eye flight tonight to Toronto, then I'm getting a flight tomorrow morning to Boston, where I'm going to a black tie dinner to honor Gary Doer and to present an award to him from the New England Canada Business Council. And my wife said, I hope you're still alive when you leave Boston tomorrow night. Look, I just want to say this about René Lévesque. Look, I liked René Lévesque. I personally always liked René Lévesque. He was a very personable guy. And one little story, in 1979, the New England governors and Atlantic premiers met at the Richelieu Hotel in Quebec. We arrived in the afternoon. We were all in the big room like this, all the governors and the premiers. He wasn't there. And 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour went by. He still wasn't there. And everybody was saying, where is Premier Minister Lévesque? We were standing over by a window, looking out the window, and we found out where he was. Do you know where he was? He was outside by the entrance of the hotel, greeting the people who are coming to work, shaking hands with them, and shaking hands with the people who are leaving work. That was a true, personal politician. There's no doubt about that. He was that kind of a man. He said to me, I said to him once, I said, you know, Rennie, why don't you come down? I'll invite you to a big dinner at University St. Anne to the 100th anniversary of the Acadian flag coming to Nova Scotia. He said, thank you very much. That's very nice of you. Do you want to get elected again? I said, yes, don't invite me. So, look, I like the man. And there's the only one thing I say about this conference and him was this. I'm like Brian. One day I thought this, next day I thought this. But, you know, this business of a referendum, we didn't want a referendum. It would have been divisive of the whole country, as Peter Lougheed always said. But listen, he turned around and he agreed with Prime Minister Trudeau on having a referendum. We didn't know he had done this. So you're talking with trust, he should have confided in us about that. Right, Peter? He should have. Yeah. He should have confided, but he did not confide with us. And Peter and Brian are right. And the morning of that meeting, we had every intention of laying everything on the proposals to Mr. Levesque when he arrived. He was late. He didn't stay that long, as I recall, and he left.
Yeah, well, we summed it up for him, because I got his eye, and I summed it up right up to here's where we are after all of this, and Mr. Lougheed is still looking at it and so on. We spent all night on it, but here it is. What do you think of it? And so on. And it was left like that for him to respond, even though he was 23 minutes late. That is very important for the record.
I have to leave because I have to be in Boston to meet my wife. My wife is driving to Boston tomorrow.
Stay for 30 seconds because we're wrapping up now.
No, I just want to say.
And your wife is from Nova Scotia.
She's from Bear River, Nova Scotia, and I'm from Cape Breton. She always said, I'm not from Cape Breton. I'm from a part of Nova Scotia so far away from Cape Breton, I'm pleased. Anyway, look, I just want to say I got to be in Boston tomorrow because she's going to be at the plane at Logan Airport to meet me. And if I don't get there, that's it.
Okay. The last word on Mr. Lafayette's
one question,
intervention.
Mr. Edwards, I'd like to ask with great respect. It's very important.
All right, we're 45 minutes over time.
It is for Mr. Lougheed.
Let's make it brief, okay?
This is for the 1,300,000 Inuit, First Nations people, and Métis. You didn't negotiate the change in Section 35 at your November conference, but later on, you negotiated by telephone and so on, and put the word existing in Section 35 in front of the recognition of existing Aboriginal treaty rights. What did you have in mind when you did that? What was your intention, and what do you think now about how the court has interpreted that?
Well, I feel very strongly that it was essential. I would not have agreed with any of it, and I had quite a few other premiers with me, unless we deal with existing rights. We weren't going to deal with the whole history of the whole Native and Aboriginal history of Canada, which is extensive and important. But I was the leader in bringing forth the word existing, because I made it clear to my fellow premiers and the first ministers that Alberta, for one, would not agree on the Aboriginal rights addition to the Constitution without the word existing there.
How did you feel about how it has been interpreted?
Well, that's a tough question. I think it's worked out all right in terms of the word existing. Anyway, I just repeat my point. I would not have supported that development in the Constitution without the word existing there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, the questioners. Thank you to our panel, and thank you to all of you for being an appreciative and attentive audience. This session for this evening is adjourned, and the meeting will reconvene tomorrow morning. Thank you, Premier Peckfod. Thank you, Premier Lougheed.